With topic 9, we now move into the second phase of Roman Catholic Church history. So we've looked at the first phase and now we're moving into the second phase. And the second era or phase of Roman Catholic Church history takes us into what is known as the Middle Ages. A lot of people have some of their own preconceived notions of the Middle Ages. Whatever your notions are of the Middle Ages probably depends on whomever you had for history in high school or maybe even here at Albertus Magnus College. But just to define this era a bit more for us, when it comes to Roman Catholic Church history, this second era goes from the time of Charlemagne, whom we've already talked about, to the Protestant reformer Martin Luther. So we go from about the year 800 to the year 1517. So again, we're going to be covering a lot of ground here. And that third period of Roman Catholic Church history is going to go from the Protestant Reformation, 1517, the time of Martin Luther, on into the 21st century. Now, a lot of people think of the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages, but it is anything but dark. All kinds of things are going on in the Middle Ages. Advances in science, advances in art, literature. This is not just the period of the Black Death, 1347, the Great Plague that destroys a lot of Europe. But this is also the era of the Renaissance. Renaissance coming from this word meaning rebirth. So this is a time of a lot of development and a lot of innovation. This is also a period of time when we start to get universities and scholastic thinking, and not just advances within science and all of that, but also advances in theology. In fact, we're going to meet some great church individuals, Roman Catholic church individuals like Thomas Aquinas in this period. Aquinas Hall at Albertus Magnus College is named after Thomas Aquinas. Well, definitions aside, there are a lot of questions that we should ask about the Roman Catholic Middle Ages and the Christian Middle Ages of Europe in general. And one of those questions is simply, well, how Christian were the Christian Middle Ages? This is a difficult question to answer, but it's comparable to asking the question of, well, how Christian is the United States? I mean, some people think of it as a very Christian country. Some people don't think it is at all. If you look back at the Christian Middle Ages, if you look back at this time in European history, what you find is a lot of what you find even today in religious countries. There are some people who are very religious. There are some people who are just superstitious. There are some people who have a kind of religiosity where religion to them isn't really about the spirit of the religion, but it's about keeping the rituals and the law. And then, of course, you have people that don't really believe in any of this. They just go through the motions. This is also a period where there is a lot of misinformation being disseminated. There is also, at times, an illiterate Christian population. Sometimes there is an illiterate clergy that doesn't know as much as they should. So there is a lack of education in this period, which the church is going to try and address. There are a couple of terms. You don't need to remember these terms, but basically in the Christian Middle Ages, you talk about Christendom, Christianitas, this Latin word, and Christianization. And essentially what that all means, to quote one of the great medieval saints of this period, Bernard of Clairvaux, is Christianity is dominant, but it's not monolithic in this period. The Latin that he uses is diversa sed non adversa. It's diverse, but it's not adverse. And as it has always been throughout Christian history, you don't have one type of Christianity in this period. Even though the Roman Catholic Church is the church and is the Christian religion at this point, there is still a lot of diversity from geographical region to geographical region, from diocese to diocese. So Christianity is the dominant faith in the Middle Ages. Roman Catholicism is the dominant church in the Middle Ages, but it's still not monolithic. And perhaps one of the biggest crises that comes out of this period, and it's been brewing for a long time, is something we call the investiture controversy. But I should tell you right away, there was not one investiture controversy. There were multiple controversies. And what all of this is about is it goes back to this issue that's been with us for a long time now. Who is in charge? The monarchy or the papacy? The church or the state? And what I mean by investiture is who has a right to put people into power? Does Charlemagne have the right to say this person is going to be bishop, this person is going to be pope, or does the church have that right? And on the other hand, who has the right to appoint kings, queens, emperors? The family lines, the bloodlines of various monarchies, or does the church have a right to do that? And this became a very, very confusing thing, especially to the masses, because I'll show you here in a moment the symbols and the symbolism that were being used by both the church and the monarchies in the Middle Ages. The symbols that were being used to give somebody authority, to invest them with authority, were pretty similar. And so this raised a number of questions if you were looking at all of this from the outside, and many people, just your average, ordinary, everyday individual, wanted to know who was actually in charge, the monarchy, the state, or the church. Well, there were two sides to this, at least two sides, but let's simplify it by saying there are only two sides. There are two sides to these investiture controversies. There was a growing papal monarchy that was claiming supreme power over all of Europe. If you were the one true church and you were the pope, then you thought you had all of the power. At the same time, there were secular leaders, monarchs, saying that we, and we only, have the right of divine kingship. That if you go back and even look at the scriptures, that it is God directly who appoints kings. Well, obviously, if you're Pope, you're going to say, well, that may be true, but I'm the representative of God on earth, so we have supreme power, not you. And again, we've seen this before. But here are some more details of the issues that are involved in all of this. The appointment of bishops and abbots to an office known as benefice in Latin is this idea, as I've already told you, of investing the bishop or the abbot with certain symbols to communicate to everyone else that this person is in charge, that this person is actually a bishop or this person is an abbot, the head of a monastery. Now, when you invest a bishop or an abbot to a particular office, you give them certain symbols. There's a ritual you go through even today where you give a bishop certain symbols. And I'll show you images of these things here in a moment. You give them the pallium, you give them the mitre, you give them the ring, and you give them the crozier. Well, at the same exact time, if you were investing a certain individual, a prince, as now the king of a particular territory, you gave them secular symbols to communicate to others that this person is now in charge. You gave them not a pallium, but a scepter, an orb, a clod or a bowl of dirt to say this is the ground over which you rule. Now, people in religious office and people in secular office probably knew that there were certain symbols that were religious and then there were certain symbols that weren't, that were secular. But your average, ordinary, everyday person in the Middle Ages likely didn't distinguish between this symbol and that symbol. So it was confusing to them as to who was actually in control because some of these symbols looked the same. But just to show you what some of these religious symbols look like, because they're still with us today in the Catholic Church. The pallium is this piece of clothing, if you will, that you wear, that you drape around yourself. It looks something like this. There are variations of it today, but it usually has Christian symbols on it. You will usually see it draping around the shoulders of a bishop. The other thing you will see the Pope and other bishops still wear these is the hat called the mitre. There's a lot of symbolism with the mitre representing the Trinity. If you are a bishop or you are a pope in the Roman Catholic Church, you will also have a ring. Oftentimes when priests or other lay Catholics meet their bishop or their archbishop, they will kneel down and kiss the bishop's ring or the pope's ring. You can imagine the problems this could cause when there's a monarchy of what happens if the king or the queen or a prince doesn't bow down and kiss the ring of a bishop or a pope. You could imagine how this works the other way. What if the Pope doesn't bow down and kiss a certain item of authority that represents authority given to a monarch? And bishops were also given these staffs called croziers. Croziers are very important because, as you can see, even though this one's very, very ornate, they don't have to be. This staff here, the head of the staff, shows the picture of a lamb. And so this is the idea that the bishop or even a pope is a shepherd of his people. And you are shepherding the sheep of your flock, an image that Jesus uses of himself in the Gospel of John. So these religious symbols were being given, invested to bishops and abbots when they would be given a particular office, when they would rule over either a monastery or a diocese. Well, the thing is, as I said, certain symbols were also being given to secular authority figures. And your average, ordinary, everyday individual didn't necessarily distinguish between these symbols. They just saw these symbols and said, okay, that person's in power. Okay, that person's in power. But the question was, especially between religious power and secular power, of which one is supreme. And it's hard to know if you were looking at this from the outside. So the question of who is stronger is very, very important in the Middle Ages and plays into these investiture controversies, because the idea is, if one side can say, we have the right to appoint your leaders, then they win. So who is the higher authority? Is it the church or is it the state? Well, what was going on here is, if you remember back to Pope Gelasius and the two swords theory, is instead of there being a separation of church and state, the government had one sword, the church had the other. Instead of there being this separation, what had happened is both sides were suddenly trying to claim both swords for themselves. Charlemagne tried to do this, certainly, and was saying, I am much stronger than Pope Leo III. But of course, Leo III is also trying to claim these two swords by saying, no, see, I'm actually stronger than you because I'm the one who crowned you Holy Roman Emperor, and you wouldn't be Holy Roman Emperor if it wasn't for me. Well, as this is getting to a boiling point, let's say, Pope Gregory VII, whose years are 1073 to 1085, comes along and creates what's known as the Gregorian Revolution. If you are familiar with Gregorian chant, this is the same Pope Gregory. His goal, and this is a very important term that I would ask you to remember, is libertas ecclesiae. This is a Latin phrase that means the freedom of the church. It has still been invoked down to this day. It is the freedom of the church to name its own bishops without government interference, to patrol what is called simony, to patrol against simony. Simony is the buying and selling of ecclesiastical offices, which was part of the investiture controversies, and to fight against concubinage. Yes, a lot of clergy, even popes during this period, even though technically they were supposed to be celibate, they weren't. They had concubines by which they had children, and then they helped their children out, especially if they were male, by getting them into certain church offices. And government officials at the same time were trying to pay off certain bishops or even pay off the Pope to put certain family members into certain religious offices. And this is known as simony. But what Gregory wanted to do was stop all of this. He wanted to clean up the priesthood, clean up the episcopacy of bishops. He wanted to clean everything up. And in the process, he wanted to say the government has no right to interfere in libertas ecclesiae, the freedom of the church to appoint its own leaders. Now, again, the question, of course, is going to be, well, if that's true, then does the church then back off when it comes to appointing secular leaders? That's kind of murky. But just so you know, this libertas ecclesiae thing has been used in the modern day and age when the Roman Catholic Church has tried to say libertas ecclesiae applies to priests, bishops, etc., in church scandals involving the molestation of children. The church has often tried to say, even the Vatican, that bishops, priests, etc., in these cases should not be tried in civil courts. They should be tried in church courts over in Rome. Now, that may be true in certain countries, but certainly in the United States has said, no, that is not how that works. If a bishop, priest, etc., commits a crime in the United States, then they have to go to civil court or federal court or use the secular courts. They don't get around this by going back to Rome or to the Vatican. And there's been a lot of controversy about this because every now and then the church pulls out this libertas ecclesiae, trying to say the secular authorities don't have a right to judge us, but we will do it instead. Now, the worry, obviously, of secular authority is that the church will side with the bishops and priests who are guilty, and that has unfortunately and wrongly sometimes happened. So libertas ecclesiae is still around today, but back in the Middle Ages, it had to do more with fighting against simony, the buying and selling of church offices, concubinage, and the church simply wanted the freedom to name its own leaders. To show you an example of this, in fact, I'm going to give you a couple of examples of this. Gregory VII and Henry VI really went at it over who is actually in charge and who has the power to appoint leaders. This battle all started over who has the right to name the Bishop of Milan, the next Bishop of Milan in Italy. And Gregory and Henry went back and forth over this. It got very, very nasty. Both called for each other's resignation. So one day Gregory would say, Henry, you need to quit. And the next thing you knew, Henry was turning around telling Gregory, you know what, Gregory, you need to quit. As if both had the power to tell the other they needed to resign from their office. So Gregory and Henry resolved this partially. It was sort of a detente. It was, we're going to stop for a bit at something known as the Concordat of Worms in 1122. And what the Concordat of Worms concluded is that the Emperor Henry VII would renounce the investiture of religious symbols. In other words, Henry, as the secular leader, Henry VI, would no longer give the symbols to certain individuals being named bishop or abbot, which means that Henry is not the person who is going to tell this person or that person they are now in charge of a particular religious office. At the same time, a later pope named Pope Calixtus II turns and tells Henry, okay, because of the Concordat of Worms, he will allow Henry to decide in his own kingdom who is in power and who is not. So in other words, what they've done is they've gone back to saying the government has the political sword, the church has the religious sword. The church will appoint its leaders, whoever is in charge, and the government will appoint their leaders. And so Henry agrees to a free election of bishops and abbots. But All he wants is to have a representative of the government present when a bishop is being consecrated, or an abbot is being consecrated or invested with the symbols to take on the role of leading a monastery. So this seems like it's all working, and this seems like a very reasonable solution, and this is very much sort of the principle of church-state being separated from one another. They are two institutions that at times overlap, but in reality their power structures are separate from one another, and they should act as a checks and balance system to one another. Now, eventually, when you get into modern Catholicism in the 20th century, this is exactly how the Roman Catholic Church describes its relationship to a secular authority. It describes it along this checks and balances system, but it doesn't always work that well in history. Classic case study of this is England in the Middle Ages. And this is something that occurred between two very good friends, the King Henry II and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, in the 1160s. Henry and Thomas, as I said, were good friends, and when all of this starts out, Becket was simply the chancellor and an archdeacon. Now, England is a little bit of a different case because England's kings always talked about the ancient custom of overseeing the church. English kings would often say, look, if you look back into the history of the British monarchy, as we would call it today, it is the king who had divine right to say who is in charge, who isn't in charge. This will come back up during the Protestant Reformation with Henry VIII and the English Reformation. So, without appealing to the Pope, Henry II names his friend, and you can see the political benefit in doing this, Becket, Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury. So without the Pope intervening in this, Henry says, no, I'm king and I have the divine right to do this. No matter what the Concordat of Worms says, I'm doing this anyway. So Henry thinks, I'm going to control the English church through my friend Thomas Becket, who is now the Archbishop of Canterbury. In fact, there's a great movie on this called Becket, a very, very famous movie that's worth watching if you want to see some wonderful acting performances and just also see more of how this played itself out. The problem, which Henry did not foresee, is that Becket was a very religious individual. He was very independent, and his loyalties were to God and to the Pope and to the church and not to his king. But Henry assumed wrongly that because Becket was his friend, he was going to defer to Henry and not to the Pope. In fact, a lot of this is what Geoffrey Chaucer is talking about in the Canterbury Tales. The shrine they are going to in Canterbury is they want to see the shrine of Becket. They want to see Becket's grave. Well, Becket essentially realizes that he cannot serve two masters. He looks back to Jesus in the Gospel saying, you can't serve God and mammon, or you can't serve God, and it's an Aramaic word for money. And he takes that as, I can't serve God in the state. I have to pick one or the other. Well, the problem that Henry has, because he's furious at Becket for this, is that because of Libertas Ecclesiae, he really doesn't have the right to try Becket for treason, disloyalty to the crown in a royal English court. And he can't threaten Becket with capital punishment because this agreement was reached between the church and the state, that the church has its own freedom to do this sort of stuff without the interference of the state. So what Henry does instead is he exiles Becket from England. And Becket is gone from about the years 1164 to 1170. But Becket is bound and determined to come back and fight this out with Henry. So Christmas 1170, Becket comes back to England and says, no, You can't excommunicate me. You can't exile me from England, but I can excommunicate you, Henry, from the church and everyone else who took the side of the crown over the side of the church. This is really important because this is something the church realizes it has as kind of the last, it's its last resort. It's the nuclear option. If you're an archbishop, a bishop, or a pope, is that you can go to the leading monarch, governor, etc., and say, well, I don't like what you're doing, so I'm excommunicating you from the church. Or you can just simply refuse to forgive them their sins and tell them, no, you can't repent of that, which means they're automatically going to hell. So that's exactly what Becket does. He shows back up on Christmas Day 1170 and says, no, I'm going to excommunicate you and anyone else who violated the rights of the church. This does not end well for Becket, and it really doesn't end well for Henry. Henry, at least the story goes, in a very drunken rage says, will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest? Now, a lot of historians think that Henry was just drunk and he was simply complaining. But there were 4 loyal knights loyal to Henry that interpreted this statement as somebody needs to go and kill Thomas Becket. Sure enough, December 29th, 1170, the story goes, these 4 knights went to Canterbury and hacked up Thomas à Becket as he held on to the altar of God in Canterbury. Henry, because of this, is forced by the church and public opinion, because everybody seemed to like Becket, is forced to make public penance for this and to take responsibility for murdering the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now you can imagine that this all of a sudden looks like the church won the investiture controversies, because this act makes it look as if Henry is not in charge and that ultimately he has to bow to the church. But as we're going to see, this is going to continue. It will certainly continue through the Protestant Reformation. It will continue on even into modern times in the 18th and 19th centuries. The who is in charge monarchy or church dissipates and in reality disappears in the 20th century.